Today we are going to see the relational model constraints. Relational model constraints are classified into three categories. One is inherent data model based constraint. Second one is schema based constraints. Third one is application based constraint. Application based constraints are classified domain constraint, key constraints. First one we are going to see in detail inherent data model based constraint. That means it cannot have same or duplicate tuple represent a constraint that is inherent in the data model. That means if the table having number of tuples, many rows, the same type of data, that is repeated data, cannot be taken. In a table, it won't take any repeated value of the constraint attribute. Key attribute data won't be repeated in a table. That is called as inherent data model based constraint. The next one we are going to see the schema based constraint. The constraint that are directly specified in the schema of a data model via DDL, data definition language. That is constraints that is directly applied or specified in the data model. The next one we are going to see the application based constraints. As in the previous slide we saw schema based constraint, the constraints are directly applied to the schema where the constraints cannot be enforced directly in the schema of a data model. The constraints are enforced within the application program in the database. Here we are going to give the constraints within the application of a program. This constraint utilization is called as normalization. This is called as normalization. The constraints here directly cannot be enforced to a schema of a data model where the constraints are given to an application program of a database. That process is known as normalization. Again, these application based constraints are classified into two types: domain constraint and key constraint. Domain constraint means it enforces the restriction has the value for atomic or single value from the domain attribute, that is DOM of AI, domain of attribute. The next one we are going to see the key constraint. Key constraint, a key that is property of an attribute in a given relation. It is the property of an attribute in a given relation from which one cannot remove any attribute till such time the uniqueness property or constraint is maintained. Once the key constraint is applied in a table, that attribute cannot be removed until the uniqueness property or constraint is maintained. Again, these key constraints are divided into many types, that is candidate key, super key, foreign key, constraint on null values, entity integrity constraint, referential integrity constraint. In further classes, I am going to explain all these types of key constraints. Today we saw the data model constraint and the key constraint will be explained in further slides. Thank you all.